Sorry, I'm just waiting. Hi, Andrew. Welcome to Venture with Grace. We're live, by the
All right.
way. So to start the show, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more. Uh, so you have worked on multiple projects. I don't want to go back to maybe like Evernote. Like I don't know how far you want to go. Like okay, so prior to starting Numeric, you were working at Segment. So maybe we could chat a little bit more about like what's a development journey like from being an engineer to CTO.
Yeah. I started the Evernote internship was when I was in college. Really cool internship. Feels very distant now. Started my career at a pretty small company. I think it was 8 people when I got there. Super tiny seed stage company. Got connected basically through university connections. In some ways, like got very good experiences out of it. In other ways, like some lessons of like what not to do. I would say the highlights were I got to work with Parker and Anthony, my co-founders there. And it was also like, I think what a lot of like right out of school engineers get if they go really early, which is kind of could do anything and everything and not a lot of like worry about doing things in the wrong way. Just a lot of like, toys in the sandbox to go hack away on. And so I think that was sort of a good chance to like really get a wide breadth of skills, maybe less rigor because of not having a real like team and management or any sort of like, not a lot of like senior mentorship, anything like that. But it was a cool experience to sort of go hack on things. The company, I think, was a fairly short-lived thing, never made it past the seed stage. So we all sort of parted ways. Anthony was a PM at BlackRock, and then I went over to Segment as an engineer. Largely because Segment had a very strong engineering brand. It seemed like a great place to be a good engineer. And that Segment, I think, got to sort of deal with larger scale of problems, got to, get my hands dirty on like some bigger stuff with a little bit more of like best practices and learning from the team around me. And then somewhere in the course of that work, started to see that a lot of like the problems were not really technical in nature, that a lot of the biggest impact were like this intersection between product and technical. And that often those decisions were sort of being made in silos, and that engineering was in some cases working on specs that had been baking on the PM and design side of the house for so long that certain assumptions seemed maybe not easy to change. And I think I started to make the jump from like fairly junior engineer to a more, let's say, aware engineer as I started to see my role less as go solve technical problems and more like help us hit our goals at whatever layer that takes place. So I think the combination of those experiences gave me, one, some confidence for potentially going and starting something. Two, like time working with my future co-founders. Three, maybe some like engineering rigor at Segment. And then four, like a real sense of wanting to care much more about understanding the users, understanding the product, understanding the overall sort of context, and then using that as a way to like make strategic decisions about what to build, what not to build. And then started this company and sort of early 2021 kicked off trying to go fix accounting, which was not something I had a background in, but have been hacking away on it ever since. And fortunately, things are going pretty well.
Totally. Okay, so I want to start with like, since you wrote a bunch of articles on like product and then building a team and then like how to, I guess, like avoid mistakes. Maybe we could start with like, what is numeric, and then we could talk about like, how do you actually start building a product? I feel like from the 0 to 1 is like very interesting. Like a lot of people just start with like, building a product and ship, and then like, the quick like flips on the MVPs, but like how do you think about building product? Maybe we start with what is Numeric, and then like we talk about like how to build product.
Yeah, so Numeric is an accounting software company. We're a Series A company, raised a large Series A last year. We're like setting out to try to fix financial data as a whole. And for us, that really means being focused on the accounting department. And so our goal is like get companies to accurate, up-to-date, rich financial data as continuously as possible, which necessarily means automating a lot of what can be automated. In a lot of ways, my goal is like lift the Department of Accounting up one layer of abstraction. I think a lot of the world of accounting is downloading CSVs, manually like setting up and managing Excel files, moving data around, error checking by sort of scanning registers of transactions, a lot of like repeated work, some of which is sort of in theory automatable.
Mhm.
And then I would say in the abstract, like accounting is sitting on a very large data problem. Everything about a company has to make its way into the financials, anything that impacts the financial activity. And the systems are fairly old and not very helpful in terms of starting to automate. Okay, how do we integrate information from other systems? How do we go reconcile across sources? How do we go set up sort of monitoring and sanity checking that these things are correct? How do we remove the human out of the loop on repetitive work? So that's our goal. It's like go at whatever layer we can solve these things, try to take the sort of current state of the world of having generally your financials be once a month, fairly out of date, often coarse grained, not super actionable data, and try to get to a world where there's rich live windows into the business. So our customers tend to be at the really small side. You have to be big enough to have an internal accounting team. So usually that means like a Series B startup would be the smallest company. And then more of the bulk of our customers sort of sit in the early public company and like late stage private company, the sort of like Figma, Plaid, Brex, OpenAI, Anthropic, that sort of size and stage of company are really our strike zone for where we can help people.
I wonder, so like, I guess like, what would be the first feature that you build, and for who? So since we mentioned like Series B and after, I feel like that's like 400 different category of companies. But like,
Yeah.
how do you think about like what's the first ICP, and like how do you turn that into like something scalable? If you want to showcase your product, we could.
Yeah, maybe you can show a little bit at some point later.
Okay.
I think sorry, the question was how I think about a sort of first product and then scaling for the right audience.
Yeah. So like basically, let's say day one, you and your co-founder sitting in an office, like what do you guys
Yeah.
do?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really strongly influenced our choices really early was just bordering on paranoia, a sense of we need to get real users, real paying users as early as possible. I
Mhm,
think I was sort of desperately afraid of being a startup that's sort of set off hacking and building stuff,
mhm,
because building is sort of fun, and not going and facing reality. And I think the longer you build without real users hammering away on all the corners of what you've made
mhm,
and starting to like give feedback, like it or not, you're sort of steadily diverging from reality. Plus, going into accounting as a domain, it's a fairly deep domain that I have a formal background
mhm,
in. We were all sort of coming in fresh to the space, which has certain benefits. But all this was to say, desperately wanted to shorten the time to first paying customers.
mhm,
So we actually went out with Figma designs and had early like design partners sign LOIs to pay us
mhm.
like a nominal fee a month, just to say, hey, when this thing is ready, we'll use it. Because we were that worried about like potentially just building in a vacuum. Um, what we built was really on the workflow side of going and starting to coordinate the process of your accounting team. I think there's sort of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs of how to run a healthy data system, of how to, be able to automate what's automatable, build in
I have
quality.
a question, sorry.
Yeah, please.
Like
No
when
worries.
Okay, sorry. When you were saying like you guys want to get like paid user immediately while you have like a Figma design, I think like as like I feel like a lot of the problem is like what if the clients just say, "Hey, like since you have no product, like we can't really pay you, yada yada yada." Do you just like keep going until someone pay, or let's say you test 10 people, let's say 4 of them immediately signed up. That's like a great market fit. Like so or and then you if that doesn't happen, let's say you after you talk to 10 people, absolutely 0 people sign up, do you just
Yeah.
quit and then work on a separate idea? How do you kind of deal with the problem of like let's say like people don't want to pay, or like people feel insecure about there's like nothing
Yeah.
there basically?
Yeah, I think it took a few reps of thinking
Mhm,
about the ideas and for I think there's probably worth pointing out, like off to the side, I'm building prototypes of some of these things largely to de-risk. Like we don't want to show something that's not going to be practically solvable.
mhm,
Um, and then there were cycles of going out to people and sort of learning about them, asking about their problems, showing demos, and then figuring out like how closely we were aligned to something they actually cared about.
mhm,
And then the paying part was really just a de-risking function. I wasn't,
mhm,
it wasn't necessarily about that first revenue. It was more about like, okay, are we serious here? Because
mhm,
inevitably your first customers are going to be early adopters. They're going to be people who are sort
mhm,
of prone to excitement about things getting better. But then the question
mhm,
is like, have you overcome that activation energy where they're actually going to go do something about it? And so it's just a little bit of a barrier to say, okay, cool, like you're really nice, you're excited about us,
mhm,
maybe just treating us as like want to be helpful. But the question is like, do you actually care about this problem enough to do something? In the end, it turned out not that hard to ask people to pay a modest amount. I think
Mhm.
this would be a lot harder if it was like a consumer app, but it turns out if you're selling
Right.
to businesses and you're coming in at, a fairly nominal fee, it sort of solves
Mhm.
the problem of de-risking. In practice, you're like a tiny blip on the budget, and it ended up not being the biggest barrier. So for us, I think it was sort of cycles. And then I think if we had failed to get anybody to say, okay, cool, I'm open to this sort of silly exercise of signing an LOI, probably means we're in the wrong place or we haven't found a problem that actually matters enough.
Okay, so basically, like, it have to be fairly easy for people to jump in, but, like, I have 2 questions there. One is, like, how much do you charge? Like, is that, like, let's say I'm sure it's, like, a fraction of what you guys are charging now, but, like, for, like, a testing thing, do I just charge, like, 10% of what I eventually gonna charge? Or, like, you talk to the customer and they're like, "Hey, we're spending, let's say, I don't know, like, 100K each year on this problem," and then you come in with, like, a 10K offer? Or,
Yeah.
like, what's a kind of vibe there?
Yeah, I would say not to overthink it would be my advice to people that are super early. I think at that time we signed up some customers at like $150 a month,
Mhm.
which is like not very even remotely related to like pricing today, nor is really the
Mhm.
product very similar. Um, you know, so it's like it doesn't really tie you down to where your product's going to go or what you're going to charge in the
Mhm.
future. And then in terms of the number, I think practically speaking, like pick a number that feels legitimate, not like $2. But you
Mhm.
probably want to pick something small enough that you don't have to like, your buyer doesn't have to run it up the ladder to the CFO because it's, if you
In
ask
their
for more than,
control.
yeah, there's a certain dollar threshold in any company where like more people are going to have to get involved. So I think we just picked something that felt like real without being like a bigger buying process for some of those early adopters. And it didn't, it didn't really tie us down in the future in terms of where we were going to go. You're always going to launch with a small, tiny product that is a shell of what's to come. And, you just have to be okay with that. And I think the
Mhm.
pricing, again, just a tool for de-risking a little bit, but not something to like overthink.
Okay, so another problem is, like, how do you convert that into, like, a, customer with longevity? Because if I feel like at the beginning, the people who are buying the cheap version of the, service or product may not be, like, the people who will end up today you guys are, like, Series B above, especially, like, the bigger companies. I guess, like, how do you, I guess, raise the bar, and
Yeah.
is the sales cycle the same as, like, from selling, like, a Series B company to, like, Series, D, E, or public company?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's a couple things probably to break down. One is like to what extent do you scale that over time and how does that go? And then like how does this impact the really early days of those first customers? I think this is actually like sort of a risky like fraught road because some especially like teams of like very like engineering heavy founders like will want to go really small where the problems are more tractable. Like you start off with like maybe one or two people building something maybe at night and on weekends. You might still have a day job, who knows. Like you're very very limited for time on the technical side to go build something, and coding is like the slowest way to solve a problem. And so the question is like how do you go launch something given these constraints? And often people's answer is like go really small where the problems are simpler. I think that's like a pretty risky road because the flip side of that is there's always an activation energy for somebody to care. Like ultimately the question is like when this person gets busy and budget gets a little constrained, are they still going to like use your thing? And then the question is like, well, what is the profile of who you've signed up? And do they look at all like the ICP, like the audience you ultimately want to go to? And the risk that I'm sort of pointing at is if you sign up a bunch of customers that are way over here and your target audience is over here,
Mhm.
these smaller customers are going to ask for stuff that these ones wouldn't ask for. If you sign up a
Exactly, yeah.
10-person company on accounting software, they might ask you if you can run payroll for them. No 500-person company in the world is going to say, oh, let's just like ask to drop payroll in here as well.
Mhm.
Like they already have a payroll system. And so your product is always going to reflect the path it took to get to where it is today. And if those
Mhm.
things start too far off, you're never really going to land in the target audience. So I think you don't want to start with people. I think the main thing is you could start smaller, but you can't start with problems that look totally different from where you're hoping to go. And so for us, what that meant is we were talking to companies in a pretty wide range of an audience, including like public companies, seeing where the overlap for the problems was. And then when we went and started with some smaller companies, it was specifically small companies that looked kind of like the bigger companies, often because the person running the department had maybe been, in audit or was a controller at a larger company. And this was a
Mhm.
smaller position, but they sort of knew the problems to come. For
Mhm.
whatever reason, it was like building the things for the right audience and then finding an entry point that still looked like those problems, as opposed to just
Mhm.
doing, whatever's most valuable for this like fairly different audience. And so we started on the smaller side, but we still started with problems that we knew were similar to, late stage startups and early public companies. And then in terms of scaling over time, I think it's really just like a strategy question. There's
Mhm.
always a tension in product development of expansion versus going deeper versus improving quality. There's like this triangle of like polish and completion, depth of how many problems you're solving and how many people you're able to support. And I would say it's always a judgment call. Like it's very much, and it's going to be influenced by the type of company you want to run. And so for us, it was a sort of very gradual ramp into larger and larger companies. But I think the biggest thing for us was we were talking to them the whole way, and we sort of understood where we wanted to go, which let us sort of say no to a lot of ideas early on that looked very useful to current customers, but just weren't going to make sense for, the ultimate ICP.
I love that. And I wonder, like, how do you gradually ramp to like a larger audience? You mentioned like you're talking the whole way. Like, I think I think a lot of audience can probably relate. Let's say you're a founder and then you're talking to the Google of the world. They're like trying to sell, let's say, out of the dev tool or whatever. Like, so you're trying to sell, or not Google, but like I guess like some traditional company. Um, let's say you kept like you meet this potential customer at the beginning. Do you ask for advice, or like do you just be like straight up selling, be like, hey, here's our product, you want to buy? And then like they're like, hey, you guys are too early for me, like, we're like this big company, we need someone who have a full on deck, like a full on like tech stack to kind of like go with it.
Yeah.
So maybe prove your stuff, and like, and then after that, like how do you maintain in touch with this potential like design partner or like this like potential customer? And do you constantly selling to them, or like do you just like, let's stay in touch, like, you grab coffee once a quarter, and like I don't know what's your cadence, but how do you kind of like eventually land them throughout the journey? And then the product
Yeah.
that, or like features product you selectively building for this audience, but they're not really paying right now.
Yeah, I'll probably stay short on details and give most of the credit to Parker, my co-founder, because I think he really ran this thread, which is like you're going to start with founder-led sales, and a lot of
Mhm.
time founder-led sales is like telling people where you want to go and what's wrong with the world and finding people that vibe really hard with that picture. As dumb as it sounds, like that's a lot of the really early sales, is finding people who like see the world in a similar way. And you could sort of point at a thing and say, is that not a ridiculous way to do this work? Like surely there's a better thing. And finding people who care a lot about that. And then you can find those personalities at companies of all different sizes.
Mhm.
So concretely, it mostly looks like asking for feedback and saying like,
Mhm.
can I talk to you about how we're thinking about things? Can I show you what we're working on? Can I ask you about your work? And then I think there's a sort of, like, you don't really have to tell people that you're open to selling them a product. Like it's sort of implied by the fact that you've started a company. And so I think you don't have to hammer on that too much. You go have these conversations, and what you're going to find, we're mostly talking about the very early stages of like
Mhm.
a sort of, call it, seed stage company. It's like you find those personalities that like vibe with the goal and the direction and the vision. And then, if they really think you're on the right track, they'll tell you like what doesn't work for them and where those challenges are. And then it's a question of like, you want to run those conversations out ahead of where you're ready, so that like, okay, how hard are we going to get smacked in the face by reality when we go try to sell into this bigger company? Like what's on the other side of the fence? Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to go tackle it immediately, but those conversations are really helpful. And then I think Parker does an excellent job of like, just maintaining some, probably roughly like every other month basis of checking in with people. I think the other thing about early companies is like you find people who care about that vision, then they're kind of curious about where you're going to go. And like, they want to hear what the updates are, even if they're not in a position to buy something. Sometimes those people will turn into advisors. Sometimes they'll buy it and be early customers. And so I think it's like, you kind of have to have a founder who's like not exactly selling, but more just like exploring the world of like people in your domain and figuring out like how people think about things differently at different stages. And then those people who are like interested to check in and get more information are also going to be the people who at some point will say like, cool, like when can I sign up? Like, what are you guys charging? And it's a very good sign when somebody asks you what you're charging for an idea, because it
Mhm.
means like if you have it ready and they could actually use it, uh, they're interested to have the conversation. So it's a lot of feedback and a lot of keeping up with people, and then also recognizing like not everybody is that way. Like even me personally, like maybe I'm not like an
Mhm.
early adopter type, like I'm fairly busy. Like I'm probably not the person who's gonna want to do that. And so you also just have to be prepared to like talk to people and just have them be like not that excited,
No.
And it's like you're gonna have to sell to those people someday, but early on
Mhm.
it's like just stay focused on the people who are excited and then go have fairly real conversations about like, is this actually important to you? Is this actually valuable? And then when people actually get onto the products, um, it depends who you're selling to, but I think like two very real signals are: one, are they willing to pay for it? In some cases, may find people are more willing to pay than to actually use the product. So the other side is just engagement. Is their team in the product every day?
I like the people who are just trying to pay but not use the product.
Yeah, it's
That's
people are
crazy.
aspirational and like they may see an exciting thing and see in that product like a better way to work. Um, but again, when people get busy, when competing like priorities take place, when they're stressed out, when somebody leaves the team, getting up and running on a new product might not be top of mind. And so it's like you have to have a product that's valuable enough to justify the activation energy to go be in the product consistently, which often is a higher barrier than getting someone to sign a contract to pay you.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I have another few questions for you about let me just put up my notes. Sorry. Like I closed down everything and now I have to open everything up. Okay. So let's say like recently bless you. So, like, I guess, like, okay, so you were talking about, um, I guess, like, developing new products, and you mentioned, like, dedicate 2 engineers exclusively on new product development and then protecting them from the day-to-day operations despite having, like, 6 to 7 engineer in total. Like, how do you think about developing new products and then prioritizing on a company's, like, long-term and short-term goals?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that is maybe, so we're really thinking a little bit later in the life cycle of a company. This is like
Mhm,
once you start selling, you've got people other than the founder selling, things are starting
mhm,
to be repeatable. Broadly, like when you're scaling, things are heating up, you're
mhm,
adding customers at a faster rate. um, my kind of perspective on things is that stuff's really hard and it's fairly hectic. It's also like very much the game of a startup is how effectively can you scale your operation as things are like changing and breaking.
mhm,
Once you found product market fit, that often feels like the whole thing. And I think you do see a lot of companies where they hit a stride with some products. They've raised a Series A or a Series B or something, and then suddenly they're in scaling mode. They're hiring quickly, and then they look around like 6, 7, 8 years later, and the product is basically the same. And I think maybe it works for more people, and then the question is like, are they happy with the product that they scaled if it's still sort of the same category, which they may be, right? Like if you're Slack and you run chat for everyone everywhere all the time, like that's awesome. Like you don't need to be a bigger category than everyone's communication channel. But the flip side is I think you see a lot of companies where like the sorts of pitch decks that they went out with in the beginning of that scaling thing looked a lot bigger, and then they're sort of the same thing. And so the question is like, why does that happen? And I think the pattern I see consistently is there are very different time horizons to be thinking about, and it's really hard to operate on multiple time horizons at a time. You're going to have a sales team that's generally thinking about this month and this quarter. You may have like a solutions and a success team that's worried about like this week, maybe even
mhm,
just the day. You're going to have some engineers who are like fixing bugs and putting out fires, and they're really thinking about like this month. And then other engineers might be refactoring things, worried about like 2 years down the line, how does this work, and are we going to still have a system we can maintain? And so I think what I've seen is as things heat up, the nature of like scaling is a lot of like incoming sales calls, customers running into new types of problems, a lot of like recruiting. And when you're working on really like working with external parties, you can't dictate their schedule. Like you can't run a recruiting process around what's convenient for you. You can't go tell a sales, process, like you can't tell a prospect like, why don't we check in a week? Like it's your job to keep things moving faster, not slower. And so as things are heating up, like it starts to become very interrupt driven of a lot of new stuff coming in, a lot of like real time sensitivity. And then you think about like what makes really excellent product development. The answer invariably is like really good individual contributors with like deep focus and long stretches of quiet time, which is almost antithetical to like, oh, things are on fire, we're scaling, we're hiring, we're fixing bugs, the infrastructure is falling over, we just signed up 10 new customers who, all need onboarding. Like these things are very, very different. And the basic logic that I think is important to remember is like, the short-term stuff always preempts the long-term stuff. If you're trying to do some deep stretch focused thing and you get interrupted by like a fire, like the short-term stuff is always it's very easy for that stuff to always just push back the long-term stuff. And if you just do the short-term stuff, as it comes up, you'll never do the long-term stuff. And that long-term stuff is deep runs into R&D land, new products. And so again, if you're Slack and your product's awesome and you serve 1 billion people, like maybe that's totally fine. Just keep the thing online. But if you're a product company that's trying to continue to go deeper, then you have to find a way to like balance these two worlds of like deep, really challenging creative work and like taking risks for the long term versus building a healthy company, keeping that momentum and like expanding the operation. So for us, the answer has largely been like firewall off a small number of engineers, put a lot of trust and faith in them to sort of navigate things, which necessarily means like load them up with context about the company. You kind of want engineers who understand the strategy, who have spent a lot of time with your users, who have dug into the domain, who have a sense of how your sales work, like kind of see the whole picture. And then get them out of the day-to-day operations. Don't put them on, don't let people message them with bugs. Don't make them sort of deal in the short term just because it's very easy to always let the long-term stuff get pushed back and back and back. And as a company, you have to like find a way to just say, okay, cool. Like we're drawing a line here. This group, this, module of people is only worried about this time horizon. And we're not going to go yank them out of that because it's very hard to get back into it. And I think this has worked really well for us. And I think, we're fairly impatient to do it just because scaling is so hectic and challenging and requires such good work from people that the default is kind of not to feel like you've got time to think about anything else. But the reality is like, if you're a growing company, it's not going to get easier. Like things don't get less chaotic and less hectic. They only just get bigger. And so I think as a company, we've continually doubled down on like, there is not a better time than now to start making these deep runs. And we have to be very disciplined about like, what's ultimately very difficult, which is like carving out a large chunk of your engineering capacity and saying these people are not on deck to deal with day-to-day problems. Really tough when everybody else is, very busy and challenged by the day-to-day problems. And so I think it's hard to do it, but I also think it probably makes the difference between a company that's like continually launching new things versus sort of feeling a little stuck in what they offer.
I have a question as a CTO. Like, okay, so as like a non-technical person, I feel like it's really hard to understand like what does it take to build a product. I know that you guys write code every day, but like, the thing is like I don't really know how to like. I think when I was like trying to build my own tech company, the challenge was like, okay, so this is obviously an amazing engineer, but how do we set up the milestone for like different product? Like, should I just tell you, hey, I think we need to build, because I feel like it's kind of the chicken and egg. So I think CTO always asks me, or like the technical person asks me, hey, can you get us like client, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, we have absolutely no product. And like, I actually don't know how to set up these milestones, or like, what do we build first? Like, and then how long does it take to build? Like, are we just building the core feature, but the UX look like, using a not very good word, shit, but like, okay, so if we just like literally build these products that look terrible and the customer don't really want to use it, how do we even test if this thing works? And then basically that, like, or do we build like something on Figma, it looks amazing, but on the other hand take the engineer 5 years to build it? Like, what's the kind of like vibe there? How do you kind of put together a milestone for the CTO to feel like, okay, I'm confident that we could get something going? But
yeah, it's an incredibly hard question. I think, and the world of like software products is fraught with failure and stagnation. Like the default is not to succeed on this front. Like the number of companies who seem to be able to continually produce new and better offerings, like, is a tiny minority of the world. And so like, this is kind of like the question around software companies is like, how do you actually do this? I'd say one, realizing I think there are certain principles that are very important. One is like the execution matters way more than the ideas. Kind of like management to ICs. Like you can't have no ideas, much in the way that like if you have 10 ICs, you really need a manager. But the flip side is like a manager without ICs doesn't do anything. It's like really nice tires on a car without an engine. Likewise, like ideas without execution are not really going to get you anything. And I think the reason is like there's a lot more good ideas than there are useful ideas, and a lot of product development is parsing out the difference and saying, okay, cool, like yeah, I could probably come up with 10 possible solutions to a problem, all of which sort of pass the like rational like reasoning from principles test of like, does that sound like it would work? And then the question is like, what actually works, which ends up being in most cases like a very technical question. Sort of like when the rubber meets the road on building and operating a product, or when the rubber meets the road on like trying to actually sell it to real people, does it actually work? And that's to me the gap between like good product ideas and useful product ideas is the useful ones are the ones that actually work. And so I think you have to have engineers who sort of see the game and sort of understand like not just the technical side, but like overall, what are we trying to do here, right? What's the actual problem? I think you have to define what you're doing in terms of the problem statement and the audience, and then go spend time with that audience. The psychology of who's on the other side of things is really, really important and does impact like even code level choices of like, okay, I'm working on this thing and I can't, software's never fully complete. You're always making choices about like what to hack, what to invest in, what to defer. A lot of those questions come down to like understanding the audience. And so I think you have to start with like, let's define a product direction, like a pain point or a set of pain points, something that looks wrong in the world, an audience, who we think we're selling this to eventually, who we think the first users are, some ideas of like what a solution might look like, but then like not holding on too strong to those ideas, because potentially all of them are going to turn out not to be useful, even though they were all good. And you're going to figure out what actually works by going into the maze and trying to build it. And then there are certain principles on the execution side, which is, often maybe underlooked, I think, as a tactical thing, but like as an engineering operation and as like a product development effort, like for everybody's psychology, you just have to tether to things that make the progress seem real. And I think this is one thing that is almost entirely about like psychology of people, is like, even if it's just a demo, or even if it's just like one tiny shitty product out to like a first beta customer, or even if it's just like a somewhat nominally defined, like we're going to be able to show the screens, like you just sort of have to pick timelines to deliver things that make it feel real, to build more confidence that it's worth continuing on the road. And I think engineers often miss this need to go sort of rebuild confidence, but it's both for them and for the rest of the company, which is if you just go into a hole and sort of keep building in silence, like, the confidence is going to wane on all sides. And so I think if you sort of agree on the direction and the rough scale of the problem, are we working on this for 3 weeks or 6 months? Like, and then you can agree on like, well, what types of milestones would give us more confidence? Again, maybe very roughly defined, of like, there's an internal demo beta of some sort that I can go click around on. If that's what like rebuilds the confidence to keep investing, those to me are the parameters for success. And so I think like my philosophies for generally trying to execute on product is like, go set up the rules of the game and the timelines, which are like the target, the general direction, the audience, the rate at which we want to sort of like deliver certain like nominal milestones. Don't try to pin down exactly what the product looks like. That's the floating variable that's going to let you hit timelines and say, okay, cool. Like if we said we want to deliver some kind of beta in 6 weeks, I'm going to go cut scope aggressively. I'm going to go change things. I'm going to make decisions about what the product actually is relative to those goals. And it just doesn't work the other way. Like you can't really define a product strictly in high detail and then expect to build exactly that, because unfortunately, like software is super messy and it never actually plays out the way you expect it to. So you sort of have to set up all the rules around the game, knowing that the thing at the middle, which is trying to build something, is necessarily going to change what you're actually building. I think there's a term I want to say, it's like called a wicked problem, which is like one where you can't figure out how to solve it without first trying to solve it. And it's very much that, which is like, you just got to set off on a hypothesis of what the right thing is. And then like, you're going to sort of find the road by going down the wrong road. But if you agree on like the high level goal of like, this is the problem we want to solve, this is the thing people are doing that we think shouldn't be done that way. I think that's the level of resolution to go set targets, if that makes sense.
Totally. Okay. So since you're the CTO and then like you have to work with the CEO and like a lot of like, other people in the company. So at the beginning or like even now, like how do you separate the work? Just because I feel like a lot of early stage founder that I've been so like I have consulted some people, they're like amazing builders. So for example, they are Yeah, I don't want to name companies, but they're like great, like maybe like a C-level from like a unicorn company, but they when they come out, they're trying to build a company, build their second company. I feel like when they are sitting with a different CEO, like the especially if the CEO come from like a finance slash VC background, it's like really difficult. So like I feel like there everybody was trying to chime in on the product. So how do you separate the work between like CEO and CTO? Like who is in charge of product? And then obviously everybody technically is, but how do you like kind of like have the dynamic that for a company to actually function? Like, who does what and how do you come to if you disagree on like a feature or product or something, like how do you kind of like come to a conclusion to keep things moving?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's probably highly specific to every company.
Mhm.
And it's gonna play out as like a combination of like the skill sets and the personalities of like who started the
Mhm.
thing. I could talk about like for us what's played out. One is like me, Parker, and Anthony are fairly different people in a lot of ways, and we have like very different skill sets. I think I'm the only engineer founder,
Mhm.
which honestly at the beginning I was like, there were periods where I was like, man, there's a absolute pile of work to do.
You single-handedly built this product,
You know,
basically.
I had help from one early engineer who did massive amounts of work, but nonetheless, like the earliest days are always defined
Mhm.
by like if you don't have a product, like that's kind of your biggest problem, and there's just a pile of work. And so there were periods in the beginning where I was like, man, maybe more technical founders would have been helpful here. In retrospect, like really glad that it's very clear that like we have different roles. I don't have the ability to do what Parker and Anthony
Mhm.
do. They can't do what I do. Everybody's good at what they do and what they like to do. And so I think um, for us, that's been really helpful. Just like really obvious like lanes of where we excel. And then I think for us, product is always kind of cuts across every founder because you don't start a company without caring about the product. Like that's everybody wants to work at the company with the best product, and if you started it, like you certainly care deeply. And in our case, like Parker had the job of our customers. So even though he's maybe the least like on the ground of building, and especially in the early days, like uh nonetheless like had especially like the most insights about the space and the audience. And so I think for us what's played out is one, being able to acknowledge which decisions we're happy to like defer and not be too involved in is really helpful. And so it's like for me personally, there's a sort of level of polish and design choice that um I may be able to do a good job on, maybe depends on the problem, but it's just not my thing. I don't feel the need to like get involved in those decisions where like Anthony's much better. And there's all sorts of scenarios of seeing like places where you just don't have to be involved in a decision and it's not necessary for you to do it. And like being able to see those and just say, cool, like I'm generally not going to be a part of this. Really helpful to go make the coordination game simpler. And then in our case, like Anthony's our head of product. And I think that negotiation between competing time horizons and priorities never goes away. And so I think the role of product is really like trying to absorb a whole lot of input streams about what might be a priority and then take a first pass on a draft and say like, okay, here's if I was going to go try to order these things holistically to say what should we work on, here's a first take. Let me sort of do the work of getting a first draft together and then go have a conversation with in our case like me and Parker, then go have a conversation with engineering as we get like closer and closer to a high resolution plan. um, and so I think that job of respecting and like taking in the inputs from everybody, understanding they're going to have differing perspectives, and then making really tough trade-offs of like, do we go build the next new thing? Do we go like launch something that's going to help sales tomorrow? How much of these can we blend? And then like what's going to execute well? I think you just have to like have somebody you trust to take the lead on running that conversation, which in our case is Anthony. And then again, make sure you land on a plan that really respects the execution. And then I think for us, the other pattern we've settled into, in terms of like there's sort of skill sets, there's preferences, there's, that sort of define the roles. And then the last thing that I think, at least for us, seems to be a pattern is among the three of us, we're always operating at different time horizons. It's like different wavelengths of thinking. Not necessarily always the same one per person, but like it's actually really helpful not to have all the founders thinking about like this week's sales or thinking about like 2 years from now, like what's this product need to look like. It's really helpful to have some split there. And I think we've naturally settled into a pattern where almost out of a sort of like contrarian nature of like, okay, if you're thinking about this, then I'm going to go worry about what I think you're not thinking about. You can often very easily see like, okay, cool. Like Parker's thinking about like the next 6 months and setting us up for success this year. Anthony's worried about customers today, tomorrow, through the end of the week, and worried about execution through the month. And then like, maybe I'm worried about like the longest term horizon. And then at some point it may switch. But for us, it's like, that's been another variable that's really helpful to delineate like who should do what, is just realize that different problems have different horizons, and don't all be thinking about the same thing at once. Because I think that's how you sort of, if you're too focused on the long term, you just won't sell anything, you won't maintain momentum, you won't build a healthy company. If you're too worried on the short term, you'll sort of fizzle out and plateau, at the next wave of challenges. And so for us, just having us on different time horizons, I think builds a sort of healthy company that is both like set up for the long term, but then like executing and building momentum in the short term.
For sure. How do you think about growth? So since you mentioned about like, some people, let's say the CEO think about what's going to happen in 6 months. And like, since you guys are a Series A company, you guys are, hitting the benchmark, hitting certain level of benchmark, like reached like, X amount of revenue. And um, for the growth to happen, like, I guess like every department have to like hire people. So like, how do you think about scaling the engineering team? So like obviously you have wrote like a few articles, like one is like the 80/20 rules for product development, and then there's another one to things to avoid in early stage startups. Like, so I don't know if you want to like chime in, like, how do you actually scale an engineering team and what to do or not to do?
Yeah, I think there's, at least for us, I think there's sort of two questions around growth. One, it's very hard. Like just growing in general is like, it's very much the game, and it takes an incredible amount of like grit and focus and energy. You need a sales team, you need a marketing team, you need people who are like locked in on like turning the faucet up and continually doing that. The flip side is like the faucet then runs down through the rest of the company. And so your solutions and success and customer support and your engineering will feel the heat from turning that faucet, and often feel it like months later, right? And I think, so a lot of what I think is important for leadership is to try to see the whole picture and just be intentional about the fact that just turning the faucet as hard as you can is probably not the right way to think about it. Which I think is difficult given how hard it is to turn the faucet. Like to build a growing, scaling operation on the go-to-market side is hard enough. To then be intentional about like how, like what those targets are, I think is not always easy. For us, I think it often comes down to like setting certain like base principles about like what's not going to change, just drawing some like fences and saying, okay, cool, like where do we want to be in 2 years, 3 years, and what's the type of person we want to hire, what's the sort of culture we want to build, what are these sort of like things that if we screw it up now we can't unscrew it up. It's like if you're building a better and better, talent dense engineering team, and then you start to go the other direction, like it's often very hard or impossible to turn that the other direction. So I think for us, it's like aligning on the really big theory, like thesis level ideas of like, this is what we hire for. This is the level of like talent and type of person. This is what we feel we want to be true about the company in 2 years. If you're on the same page about that, then you can sort of walk back to growth today and say, okay, cool. Like, what are we willing to do or not do on the sales side that allows us to still be able to do these things? And so, I think it just depends on your specific company. In our case, like we have sort of picked a lane on the engineering and the product and in probably like talent in general, which is like, we have a bar of like what we view as like excellent. And frankly, we'll hire as slowly as we have to continue to hit that bar. And my goal is like go as fast as we can hitting that bar. But the reality is like, if we have to make a choice between missing our hiring targets or hiring people that we don't feel reach that bar, like we choose like miss the hiring targets every single time, which is incredibly painful. But it's one of these like unretractable mistakes, if that's critical to your business, which for us, I think it is. And so I think growth is just being on the same page about the really big picture setting some, and then I think there's this ongoing negotiation, but as long as you like agree on the foundations of like, these are the things that must be true about the business, then those day-to-day decisions of like, can we sign the sales contract? Can we try to commit to this new sort of product offering on a time horizon? Like some of these things that could be a great thing or a terrible thing for the company are just purely execution questions of like, well, if we do this and it helps growth, does it make it harder and impossible to go hit the longer term things? And again, I think that negotiation in our company often is like the three of us, and then often like Anthony kind of taking the lead on trying to make some of the tough calls. And you're not going to get them all right, but that's kind of how I think about it. I'm not even sure if I've answered your question or if I've hit on a totally different side of the sort of growth thing than what you were asking.
Oh yeah, I think I completely hear you on like the hiring slow, but like, I constantly hear people say hiring slow, firing fast. I wonder when you're thinking about like the talent bar, what does that even mean? So like I know that obviously they have to have a certain type of technical chops, like assuming the interview involves like people doing a certain task or like showcase, I don't know, your GitHub or something.
Yeah.
Um, maybe walk me through like first of all, what's your tech stack as a CTO of a company? And like, obviously right now everybody's using AI. What does that mean? Like, are you using DeepSeek, Anthropic, like just like cloud or whatever? Like literally, are you using everything all at once? Or how do you think about AI in this thing? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm like literally throw 5 questions at you. Take whatever you want. Okay, go. Tech stack.
Yeah. I guess maybe I can touch in like two words on the hiring bar thing, and then we could switch over to the like AI and how we're building side. I think for us, our basic heuristic is like, if you're working on like the most brutal, hard, like creative, technical product questions, if you're in a room with whiteboards covered in like scroll and you're really in it, and then we think about a candidate that we're interviewing with, like the base question always is, okay, this person walks into the room
Mhm,
and you're trying to work through some messy questions. Do they speed you up or do they slow you down? And
mhm,
does your energy level go up or go down because they've walked in? And the game is only hire people that increase your energy level to work on really hard problems and that you think are going to speed you up. And then everything else is just how effectively can you align your interview process to really nail those questions. But to do excellent work, obviously I'm mostly talking about the product and engineering side. I'm not doing a lot on the other side of that house,
mhm,
hiring wise. But if you hit those questions of people that like make it higher energy and more fun to go deal with really hard problems, and they can sort of
mhm,
speed up the rate at which you can think about things, like that's what you're going for. And then it's just how dialed is your process, which I think should just get better and better. I think I've probably interviewed hundreds of engineers at this point, and so there's a lot of like trial and error for how to find those things. Okay, changing gears to the sort of like tech stack and AI thing. Tech stack's probably a little very simple, very straightforward, like trying to keep things as simple as possible. So we just lean heavily into Postgres for a database. It's a great like multi-purpose tool. As an engineer, I kind of am strongly biased that the better you understand relational databases, the better you understand computer science and programming, in a lot of ways. And then we use TypeScript everywhere. It's really nice to have one language across the stack,
mhm,
especially in our sort of like engineers having very holistic jobs at this stage of things. Like being able to use one tool chain end to end is really nice. And then we lean very heavily into observability and depend very much on Datadog for all sorts of things. We use dbt for like transforming data pipelines and sort of projecting write models into read models, which is really important for us. And then in terms of the AI thing, I would say we're just sort of like constantly experimenting. I think it in some ways it's very exciting because things are always new and changing, and there's like new stuff to go try out as of like this week. It can feel a little bit like shifting sand. And so I think you just have to pick an allocation of like how much time you want to spend on the experimentation, because if you spend all your time on it, like you may find that a month from now, what you did is totally throwaway work. The flip side is like, if you're not keeping up, then you have no idea what you're missing. And the pattern that we've seen emerge in our space is we sort of have a very like data dense product. We're like deeply integrated to accounting systems and pulling out like transaction level information. We also have a very workflow heavy product where people are logging in every single day. They're like tagging each other in comments. They're like messaging, they're attaching documents. They're like tracing how they're pacing against their goals. And the cyclical nature of accounting is like how quickly they're closing the books each month. And so we're sort of taking the data to drive like what needs your attention, what's changed, what doesn't look right, where there are anomalies, and then go to kick off the sort of workflow side of, okay, who should be doing this? And so AI for us often is like, if you go nail the workflow and the data, then the opportunities for automation sort of emerge naturally, which is like we've gone and tried to make the human job as easy as possible. And then in some cases, we can go sort of take off swaths of work. And so that's been really reliable for us, this theme of like own the workflow, then go really deep on trying to solve things at the data layer, and then take a step back and say, okay, what in this story can we sort of automate as much as possible to try to increase the quality and get people out of the sort of most like toiling drudgery parts of their job. I think we try to automate the most boring stuff is really like what I hope to do for users. A couple other things that AI like are particularly interesting for our space is one, there's a whole sort of expert knowledge side to accounting, which is just understanding guidance and accounting rules and how to, broadly account for things that LLMs are actually pretty good at, just absorbing huge troves of information and then coming up with a first draft of like, here's how to think about this. Here's how to like deal with this situation. And then more generally, I think what's interesting about our space is accounting is a totally like finite defined system. Like there are rules about how accounting works. You have this very like structured system in the middle, and then you have the infinite complexity of the world. Anything can happen. You can be a video game company that's just given a refund on in-game currency that you charge for with credits that are pre-bought. And then there's like this translation layer, which is like, this is a totally ridiculous like scenario, but like it's a very real potential thing. It's like, how do you like translate arbitrary, infinitely complex real world into the structured system of like how to understand finances? I'm pretty optimistic on AI as this like interpretive layer to be able to connect the semantics of like what's happened in the world into a system that's really the abstractions of how to go represent that in terms of your finances. I think historically the answer here would be like, well, now I got to go build a video game module to my product to be able to handle that situation. I need a new UI for somebody to be able to go represent what happened there, or I need really, really expert users who know how to translate that into the semantics of like our software. And historically, those were your only options. Like have an abstracted system that can support that. Like, maybe Excel is the most abstracted thing, but then you need really expert users who know how to like be power users of that tool and translate this messy real world thing into that system. Or you got to go build a specific UI and say, okay, here's the lease accounting module. Here's exactly how you deal with your office leases. Very easy to use, but then you're going to spend a great deal of engineering time building, more surface area. So I'm optimistic for AI as like this bridge to go be able to take somebody from, okay, just describe the situation, give us the document, and we can go generate a first draft for how we would account for that with LLMs, which I think dramatically cuts down the amount of engineering features that you have to build to be able to like support a fairly wide range of problems. And so it rewards good abstractions. If you have a system that like can support many things, the number of like training calls you have to do with users, the number of different UIs you have to build, the number of like flavors on top of those abstractions you have to produce should be like way lower if we have this now like fuzzy translation layer that's really suited to go do that. So that's for our particular space, probably like some of the most exciting thing. And then again, day to day, we're just, there's a certain amount of time that should be allocated to experimenting and seeing what's changed and looking again and again at like, where else could we potentially make use of some of these tools?
I wonder, like, as a CTO, like, what's your content diet look like to actually educate yourself on the newest, like, AI tools? And how do you filter out, like, what to try, what not to try? Since you have paid clients, I feel like that's very different than, oh, okay, I'm just building this from yesterday, and like, I can try whatever. Like, if it breaks, it breaks. But right now, there is a lot of, security reasons because you guys are like touching the transaction or like I guess like financial data of like each big like different big companies basically. Like I feel like a lot of it were I guess like security related or like let's say like sustainability. Let's say if you tried a different tool, will this like really work? Like how do you kind of like consume the information of the newest AI features and decide what to use or not to use?
Yeah. So I guess like two things in there. One, like what's that learning and iteration look like? And then two, like what are the nuances of actually delivering something and does that impact how you do the former.
Mhm.
Honestly, it's kind of the same as anything, which is like, go get your hands dirty, go write some code, go build some prototypes, and then do some reading. And I think, like, I don't know, that's kind of my approach to everything, is like kind of ping pong between two layers of abstraction, of like read up on something, then go like work on it concretely, and then like go back to the reading. And I think I would recommend this just for technology in general. It's like, if you want to know how a certain like leading edge database works, like go spin it up, go run against it, go like poke at the edges, then go to the docs and read about like the concepts, and then go all the way back down to the low level of like trying it out. And honestly, as a CTO, I probably have like a little bit less time, frankly, to do that. And so it's like making sure to carve out time really for anybody on the engineering team to go do that. You just got to have engineers who are excited to go learn, and then they'll go sort of plunge into the deep and figure out like what's out there. In terms of then what it means in our space for being able to use these things and being able to deliver to customers. One, I think we've had to like set up fairly like probably some of the first things where it's really important to just have like configuration to be able to turn things off and on. And we've got customers who, for whatever reason, like are, from an infosec standpoint, don't want to use a certain feature. We've also got customers that like run, these models and like serve these APIs. They don't really want to use their competitors. So we've had to like go set up gates where they can use specifically theirs, which is totally cool. So we had to like spend a little bit of time just getting that set up, because I think it's very much like it's a situation shaking out in real time, and just giving people some optionality, understanding that like not every infosec team is going to come down on the same side of the issue. It has just been like a necessary step. For our product, there's like different surface areas, and so not everything's like equally risky, I would say, in terms of taking the information, getting potentially fuzzy outputs. What do you do with that? I think LLMs and broadly like the whole class of technologies still have the same general like situation, which is you can't guarantee the outputs. And so if you're going to go like write data or mutate information, there's a real risk there. And I think then for us, for some of the like deeper automations, the answer is sort of similar to what I was saying before, which is like, don't try to like one shot the whole thing. Don't try to like just throw an AI thing at a problem and expect the outputs to be sort of solved. Like build the structured core, especially like if you're going to modify somebody's like financial information, build the structured core where you've got just normal unit tested, like guaranteed behaviors about like what you're able to do, what's correctness, what's like sort of verifiable behavior. And then the contract of what you've built, like the interface for what the inputs and how to use it are, expose that as the target output to AI, right? And then you can say, okay, cool, like AI is going to do some fuzzy outcomes in terms of how it interprets something, how it parses a document, whatever it then plugs in. If this code runs, it's at least valid outputs that have passed tests and passed validation. And I think for us, that's been a pattern that's been really useful. Totally specific to our world of like accounting. But it's a nice pattern, again, to sort of be able to bridge the gap between like how much can I automate here without depending on it to do potentially like very complex math over time on sensitive information. And that part is like, just probably don't like just go build that central core, figure out that middle abstraction or like that sort of center abstraction, and then use AI to like work against that contract. I think is a pattern that's like emerging for us.
Okay, so I want to be mindful of the time. Maybe we do like one real question and then quick 30-second fire round.
Okay,
Or
sure, great.
okay. So one real question is like, how do you hire the best engineering talent? Or like what are, let's call it, 3 things that you did differentiately from, like what a normal person could think to like hire the people. Obviously, most people come from, I guess, referral or like, this engineer knows that engineer kind of vibe. But how do you, I guess, like acquire the best talent quickly?
Yeah, part of it's same thing I said earlier, which is like just a stubbornness about this is like a big part of it. You just have to get better at recruiting. If you're not able to hire people in the target that you're going for, you could always change the target and open the the range of who you're looking for. But if you refuse to do that, then you just have to get better at recruiting. And so I think that's one thing is like, and to be honest, it doesn't feel that long since this was a brand new company and sort of everything was fungible. What's the name of the company? What does the brand look like? What are we selling? Who are we selling to? What should we build? Like everything's sort of on the table that you can change. And so I think for us, just building a culture and a team that's like the type of people we want to work with has been like the immutable characteristic. It's like everything sort of has to morph around that base assumption. And so then you just have to like iterate on everything else. And there's a lot of execution on recruiting. I would say then knowing what makes your workplace different and distinct is really important, and understanding, specifically for whom this is the best place they could go work. And if you're going after better, like really good people, they go work anywhere, right? Like they could, especially like engineers who can churn out products, like everybody wants those people and they could go do anything. And so it's like, it's a huge ask to ask someone to like, especially, and again, you get the really ambitious people who are like just chomping at the bit to go win and execute. Like you're asking somebody to put a great deal of their very sought after talent and energy and asking them to like commit fully to like your thing. It's just a huge ask. And so I think you have to be very honest about like who's not the right person, who would generally like actually have a better time at a different company. And then just like really nail what you're good at, right? And so I think like if you're SpaceX, like you're going after people that want to launch rockets, pretty easy to go find those people. You have this like big built-in advantage, which is like people who want to do that, there's not that many places they could do it. For us, it's like it's a bit more nuanced, which is like the way we work, the sort of like high context engineer making a lot of product decisions, meeting their users, being very in touch with the domain, as well as like being given a lot of leeway to sort of think about things from principles. Like it's a different way of working than most companies. And it's like, we're not SpaceX, so we're not attracting the people who are launching rockets, but we are attracting people who haven't gotten that experience in other places. And so for us, like that's been the thing to nail, is just like have a very opinionated way of working that really speaks not to everybody. Like if you're trying to speak to everybody, you're going to miss. It's have something that's opinionated enough that it's not the right place for some people, and then go be really intentional about finding the people for whom it really is a good match. I think if you hold those two things, then the rest is just sort of execution and a whole lot of legwork to go find people, get in front of them, figure out how to communicate to them where you're going, what you care about, what the company is like. And then just, keep hammering on the problem. Like everything, execution's like 90%. And so you just have to be willing to put in a whole lot of work for it.
Okay, so we're at the end of the chat. Okay, so what's your favorite book?
My favorite book?
Yeah.
I will say I read Deep Work recently. This is not my favorite book. That feels like a very shallow thing to mention a self-help book as a favorite book, but maybe I'm not cultured enough. But this is what I was reading recently. I reread Deep Work like every 2 years just to remind
You're
myself.
that person?
Yeah, and it's just a reminder of like, let's make sure to do great work. And it's like a tome of like, do the most important, excellent work of your life. So God, I sound like such a person who would be on a venture podcast, but
Exactly.
I'm gonna say Deep Work is like, I would recommend it to virtually anyone. It's such a good book.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Well, God, at the risk of inflating their egos, like Shirley, Parker, and Anthony, who have just been a lot of fun to work with. I think one of the fun things about a company is you just handle all sorts of problems all the time, and getting to work with a really good team of people who are going to go to bat and work their ass off lets you learn faster than anything else. So I'm very grateful to get to work with them.
My quick question on that is like, how do you build trust? Or like, how do you, I guess, like, are you guys like all BFFs before starting the company, or was it just more towards like a business relationship first?
Yeah, we were friends. I think it's what you're looking for is like mutual two-way respect. Somebody that you genuinely believe is good enough, is so good at what they do that you could learn a lot from them, and they feel the same way about you. If you don't hit that, which to be clear, like you got to be good at what you do for somebody who's good at what they do to feel that way about you. But it's like if you have that two-way respect, I don't know, then just like have fun and like socialize and just be people that you enjoy being around. And that's to me, that's the foundation of trust, is like some deep lying respect for your abilities and talents, and then like somebody you enjoy hanging out with and working on tough things with.
Are you guys like the people who go to gym together, live in the same apartment building, and like have dinner every single day? Like, or are you more towards, okay, let's see each other at work and then peace out? Like, or I guess what's a cadence before this become a real thing?
Somewhere in the middle, I would say. We've Yeah, somewhere in the middle. Parker and Anthony were once roommates, so way back
Okay.
when they were actually living together. But I don't know. It's we hang out on weekends and grab a beer or a glass of wine on evenings, and um, but we're not. It's like they see a lot of me, and so I think it's not every weekend, and it's definitely not every evening, and I think they would get probably tired of me. So I don't know. Somewhere in the middle is like we still very much enjoy just our friendship. But we also we get a lot of hours together, so it's not like we got to be seeing each other all the time outside of work.
I feel you. Oh, okay. So who would you invite to your dinner party?
What's that?
Who would you invite to a dinner party?
Who would I invite to a dinner party? Oh man, a specific name is not coming to mind, but I will say I feel like I'm very wrapped up in the world of like company building and tech and startups. So I would invite anyone who doesn't do that. I was at a party of
Oh,
like law
wow.
school students recently, and the thing about people in law school is they're all talking about law school all the time, and they were sort of delighted that I was the only person who just knew nothing about law school. Um, so I guess in my current mood, I'm really in the mood to spend time with people who do very different things from me. So yeah, no specific names are coming to mind, but somebody who doesn't know anything about software and startups and who has their own thing is like who I would invite to a party today.
Wow, that's a vibe. I literally thought you were gonna say Elon Musk, but
Oh
uh,
God. Yeah, that would be this would be a particular moment in time to invite Elon Musk to a party.
where can we find you outside of work?
um Playing soccer or at home playing like piano and guitar. I tend to just that's kind of where I spend my time is like a lot of pickup soccer and a lot of like music, and then a lot of coffee shops. I really like coffee, probably a little bit too much, and that's where a lot of my time is spent. Is either at the living room playing music, at a coffee shop, or getting some pickup soccer in.
Oh wow, you read deep work at the coffee shop and then play piano and code.
I know, I'm
But,
terrible.
oh wow. Love that. Okay, so well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming to the show today. It was such a fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. It's been a lot of fun. What a way to kick off the day.
Okay, let me quickly end stream.